At 8:42 in the morning on March 12, 1944, in the flooded field south of the village of Korniy Ostrov in western Ukraine, a single M4A2 Sherman stood motionless on a low rise of mud, its diesel engine coughing like a dying animal while 3 German tanks maneuvered into firing positions along the tree line 600 meters away. Steam lifted from the Sherman's exhaust, thin and uneven, as if the machine itself were gasping for breath. Inside, the crew listened to the engine stutter and fade again, knowing that if it died completely, there would be no time to restart it. German Panzergrenadiers were already advancing through the reeds along a drainage canal, their figures dark against the gray sky. A Panzer IV OSP-J rolled forward on the left flank, its long gun settling toward the stalled Sherman. The Soviet crew could hear the whine of its turret motor through the wet air. The Sherman's mechanic, Guard Sergeant Nikolai Sorokin, was kneeling over the open engine compartment, his hands black with fuel and sludge. He tore something from his own kit bag, began wrapping it around a metal cylinder, and forced it into place with shaking fingers. The gunner whispered, "If it dies now, we burn." The engine coughed again, then fell silent. How did it come to this? 6 hours earlier, at 2:41 that same morning, the 1st Guards Tank Army began pushing west from the marshy lowlands near the southern Bug tributaries, advancing through a belt of villages and flooded fields toward Korniy Ostrov. The Red Army Command intended to break the German defensive line protecting the road network leading toward Proskuriv. The terrain was suffering from early spring thaw. Snow still clung in shaded forests, but the fields were liquid mud. Every vehicle sank to its hubs. Rivers overflowed their banks and turned meadows into shallow lakes. The Sherman belonged to the 64th Guards Tank Brigade, part of the 1st Guards Tank Army. It was a Lend-Lease M4A2 with a General Motors twin-diesel engine, valued for its reliability and fuel economy. But diesel had its own enemy in cold, wet conditions. When water contaminated fuel or when sediment stirred from the bottom of poorly stored drums, filters clogged quickly. Without clean fuel, the engine starved, choked, and died. This mattered more on this mission than on any before it. The brigade had been ordered to advance along a narrow raised track between flooded fields. There was no room to bypass a stalled tank. If one vehicle stopped, the entire column behind it would halt, exposed to German artillery and ambush teams armed with magnetic mines and Panzerfausts. Every engine had to keep running, no matter what. Guard Sergeant Nikolai Sorokin had joined the army as a tractor mechanic before the war. He had repaired diesel engines in collective farms near Voronezh and later learned American machines when Shermans arrived in Soviet units. He trusted diesel, but he feared bad fuel. In winter and early spring, fuel drums were often left half buried in snow or mud. Condensation formed inside them. Rust flakes fell from their inner walls. Sometimes water seeped in through damaged seals. To Sorokin, every refill was a gamble. He was 30 years old, thin, with a narrow face and hands permanently stained dark from oil. He did not speak much. The crew knew him as a man who worked until his fingers bled and then worked more. Their tank commander, Lieutenant Pavel Krutov, trusted him completely. If Sorokin says the engine will live, he often said, then it will live. But Sorokin knew something the others did not. 2 nights earlier, while refueling from captured German fuel drums mixed with Soviet supplies, he had noticed a strange gray sediment swirling near the bottom of one barrel. He filtered that fuel twice through cloth before pouring it in. Even so, he feared it was not clean enough. At 5:17 in the morning, as the column began moving, Sorokin listened to the engine with his ear pressed against the armor plate. It sounded uneven. Not broken, but hungry. By 6:03, after only 11 kilometers, the engine began to hesitate on acceleration. Each time the driver pressed harder, the engine responded with a delayed, rough surge. Sorokin said quietly, "The fuel is not breathing." They stopped briefly behind a low ridge of frozen mud. Sorokin checked the primary fuel filter. It was already dark with residue. He cleaned it as best he could, washed it in a small tin of diesel, and reinstalled it. They moved again. At 6:51, as they entered the outskirts of a half-abandoned farming village, the engine lost power, climbing a slight rise. It did not stop, but it weakened. German mortar rounds began falling in the fields to the south, walking closer. They could not stop again. The column had to push forward. By 7:34, they were alone on the raised track, the rest of the brigade delayed by broken bridges behind them. The Sherman had become the forward shield of the advance without intending to be. Then the engine coughed hard, stumbled, and nearly died. They rolled onto a low rise overlooking flooded fields near Kornei Ostrov. German infantry fire cracked from the distant tree line. A Stu-G3 OSG appeared between two barns, its low silhouette almost hidden in smoke and fog. Another armored shape moved farther left. The Sherman slowed, struggling to pull itself through the heavy mud. Sorokin felt the engine with his hands. The fuel line vibrated unevenly. The pump was working, but nothing clean was reaching it. "The filter is choking," he said. "It is full." They had no spare. He pulled the filter housing apart. Thick gray-brown sludge coated the inside. Water beaded among it like sweat. He tried cleaning it again, but the residue returned immediately when fuel flowed back in. The engine coughed and lost power. German shells began landing closer now, geysers of black water and mud rising around the tank. They tried to reverse, but the engine stalled. Silence filled the fighting compartment, broken only by distant gunfire and the hollow thud of shells. Sorokin looked at the useless filter in his hands. Without it, debris would destroy the pump and injectors in minutes. With it clogged, the engine would never run again. Outside, Panzergrenadiers were already moving through the reeds. Sorokin opened his kit bag and stared at what little he had left. Then he took something out that had never been meant for an engine. Behind him, the gunner whispered that German tanks were spreading out. The driver said quietly, "If we do not move, they will take us alive or burn us." Sorokin began tearing the object into strips, his hands working fast despite the shaking in his fingers. The engine was dead. And 3 German tanks were closing in. The object Sorokin tore apart was his own winter scarf, a thick woven strip of wool soaked for months with oil smoke and diesel fumes. He cut it with a pocket knife into long bands, then folded them again and again until they formed a dense pad. He rinsed it quickly in a tin of clean diesel, squeezed it hard, and forced it into the empty metal shell where the original fuel filter had been. The Sherman was never meant to run on wool. The American filter was a layered paper and mesh cartridge designed to trap fine particles without choking the flow. Wool was coarse, irregular, unpredictable. But Sorokin knew something about wool. On tractors in his youth, when proper filters were missing, farmers stuffed felt, rope, even horsehair into fuel lines to keep dirt out. It was dangerous, but sometimes it worked. He sealed the housing as tight as he could and shouted, "Crank." The starter motor whined. The engine coughed once, then died. German small arms fire rattled against the hull. Mud splashed over the engine deck as a shell burst nearby. Sorokin adjusted the wool inside the housing, loosening it slightly so fuel could pass. His fingers were numb from cold and soaked with diesel. Again. The starter screamed. The engine fired, stumbled, then caught. Thick gray smoke poured from the exhaust as dirty fuel burned. "Keep it slow," Sorokin warned. "If you starve it, it dies. If you flood it, it dies." The driver eased the throttle. The tank began to crawl forward, slow but alive. A Panzer IV on the left fired. The shell struck the mud bank just short of the Sherman, spraying water and earth across the glacis. The Sherman turned its turret and fired back. The first round missed, slamming into a barn wall. The second struck the Panzer IV's track guard, tearing metal and forcing it to halt. They moved again, inch by inch, engine breathing through wool. But the improvised filter was already darkening. The fuel was filthy. Every liter brought more poison into the system. Sorokin stayed in the engine bay as much as he could, tightening clamps, watching the line pulse. He could feel the wool thickening, clogging again. A Stu-G3 emerged from fog at 400 meters. It fired. The shell punched through the water ahead of the Sherman, throwing a wave over the bow. The Sherman fired twice in return. The second shell struck the Stu-G's superstructure, tearing it open in a flash of fire. But the engine faltered again. Sorokin ripped the housing open, wrung the wool out like a soaked rag, and shoved it back inside. Each time he did this, more fibers tore loose. If they entered the injectors, the engine would be ruined. Panzergrenadiers were now less than 150 meters away, moving between reeds and low trees. Their machine guns hammered at the tank, bullets sparking uselessly off steel. The engine began to cough harder. Sorokin knew the wool alone was not enough. He needed something to trap fine sludge without choking the flow completely. He searched his kit again and found a small square of gauze meant for wounds. He layered it inside the wool, trying to make a crude two-stage filter, coarse wool to catch heavy dirt, fine cloth to stop what remained. He sealed it again. Crank. The engine started, stronger this time. It did not sound healthy, but it lived. The Sherman surged forward, climbing out of the shallow basin toward the low ridge where German tanks had been moving. A second Panzer IV appeared on the right. It fired. The shell struck the Sherman's turret ring, jamming it halfway through its turn. Now the tank could not rotate its turret fully. The gunner fought the stuck traverse, forcing it by hand. Sorokin felt the engine hesitate again. The gauze was already clogging. He whispered, "Not yet. Give me a little more." The Sherman fired again, hitting the second Panzer IV in the side. Flames poured from its engine deck. Only one German tank remained now, farther back, firing from near the tree line. But the Sherman's engine suddenly lost power. It did not die, but it slowed badly. The wool filter had become a solid mass of sludge. Sorokin tore it open again, his hands shaking. Outside, German infantry were running now, closing the distance while the last Panzer fired again. He had nothing left to use. Then he saw the crew's spare rag bundle used for cleaning the gun. It was thin cotton, torn from old shirts and bedding. He layered it differently this time, cotton first, then wool around it, then gauze as a final skin. A three-layer trap. He pushed it in, sealed it, and pounded the housing shut with a wrench. Crank. The engine roared to life, louder than before, smoke pouring out in thick black clouds. The driver pushed forward hard. The tank lurched, tracks clawing through mud, climbing the rise. The last Panzer fired again, but its shell flew wide. The Sherman fired back. The round struck the Panzer's turret front, cracking armor and killing the gun. The German tank backed away, smoking, then turned and fled toward the trees. But Sorokin could feel the engine trembling. The filter would not hold much longer. They were alive. But not safe. And the worst was still ahead. The Sherman rolled forward another 300 meters before the engine began to fade again. The sound changed first. What had been a rough but steady growl became thin and hollow, as if air was entering where fuel should be. The driver eased the throttle, trying to keep the engine alive without starving it. Sorokin leaned over the open compartment, his face close enough to feel the heat from the block. He could smell the cotton burning slightly where fuel soaked it. The improvised filter was no longer filtering. It was becoming fuel itself. Behind them, the flooded basin they had crossed began to fill with German infantry again, cautiously moving forward after the retreating tank. The Panzergrenadiers had seen that the Sherman could still move, but they also saw its weakness. They advanced slowly, spreading out, waiting for it to die. Ahead, the raised track bent toward a cluster of low houses at the edge of Kornyi Ostrov. Beyond the village ran a shallow river branch, swollen by meltwater. On the far side, Soviet infantry from a rifle regiment were dug in, waiting for the tanks that had been promised to them at dawn and never came. The Sherman was supposed to be one of those tanks. The engine stumbled. Sorokin struck the filter housing with his fist, as if anger could force fuel through cloth. The engine answered with a single weak surge, then sagged again. "We will not make the village," the driver said. Sorokin looked around the engine bay. He had nothing left to sacrifice. Every scrap of cloth was soaked, shredded, or already used. Then he noticed the crew's drinking water bag, hanging from a hook near the radio. It was made of layered canvas and rubber, meant to keep water cool. Inside, only a little remained. Sorokin shouted, "Give it to me." The commander hesitated only a second, then handed it back through the narrow space. Sorokin cut it open. Inside was a lining of thick, fine canvas bonded to rubber. He tore the layers apart, separating the fabric from the inner skin. He used the rubber to seal leaks around the filter housing, making it tighter than before. Then he folded the fine canvas into thick pads and placed them inside, replacing the cotton that had begun to burn. He wrapped what little wool remained around the outside as a coarse layer. His hands were bleeding now from cuts made by metal edges and cold stiff fabric. He closed the housing. Crank. The starter motor groaned. The engine coughed twice, then caught. It did not roar. It breathed slowly, carefully, like a wounded animal that knew any sudden movement would kill it. The Sherman moved again. German fire followed them. Bullets rattled against the hull. A Panzer IV streaked past the rear deck and exploded in the water beyond. They reached the first houses of the village just as the engine began to lose strength again. The houses were low, built of mud, brick and timber. Smoke drifted from ruined roofs. A German machine gun opened fire from an upper window, bullets hammering the turret. The Sherman fired once. The house collapsed inward. The tank rolled into the center of the village and then, finally, the engine died completely. No coughing. No hesitation. Dead. The Sherman stood still in the middle of Kornei Ostrov, smoke from its last exhaust drifting upward like a signal. German infantry began to move in from the fields. Sorokin dropped to his knees beside the engine. He tore the housing open. The canvas inside was black and swollen. The fuel in the line was thick, almost gray. There was nothing left to use. He stared at the engine as if it were a living thing that might answer him. The commander spoke quietly, "We will fight as long as we can." Then gunfire exploded around them. German infantry rushed between houses, firing from doorways and windows. The Sherman's turret, still partially jammed, turned slowly by hand. The gunner fired again and again, smashing walls, tearing through trees, breaking bodies. But the tank could not move. A Panzer IV appeared at the edge of the village, the same one that had retreated earlier. It had turned back when it saw the Sherman stopped. It fired. The shell struck a house beside the tank, collapsing it in a roar of dust and flame. The Sherman fired back. The shell hit the Panzer's side, but at a poor angle. It dented and cracked armor but did not penetrate. The Panzer fired again. This time the shell struck the Sherman's front, denting armor and shaking the entire hull. Inside, dust and rust flakes fell like snow. The commander shouted, "One more. Kill it or we die." The gunner aimed carefully. The turret jam made aiming slow and painful. Sorokin stood by the dead engine, listening to battle through metal and smoke. The gun fired. The shell struck the Panzer's lower hull, just above the track. The armor split. Flames burst out. The German tank went still. German infantry began to fall back again, dragging wounded, pulling away from the village. The Sherman remained alone, silent, unable to follow. Soviet infantry finally reached the village from the far side of the river, running through shallow water, firing as they came. They drove the remaining Germans away. The battle was over for Kornei Ostrov. But the Sherman did not move. Hours later, engineers arrived with tools and clean fuel. They drained the tank. What poured out looked more like soup than diesel, thick with water, rust, and dirt. They removed the injectors. They were clogged with fibers, sludge, and ash from burned cloth. The pump had survived, but only barely. One of the engineers held up the ruined filter and said, "What madness is this?" Sorokin said nothing. They cleaned the system for hours, flushing it again and again until clean fuel finally ran clear through the lines. New filters were installed. The engine was started. It lived. That night, the brigade commander visited the crew. He looked at the wrecked village, at the dead tanks beyond it, and at the Sherman that had somehow fought when it should not have. He said to Sorokin, "They laughed when you stuffed cloth into an American engine." Sorokin answered quietly, "If they laughed and lived, it was enough." But in reports, the officers wrote something else. They wrote that a tank had fought 3 German armored vehicles and survived when it should have died in the mud. They did not write how. And that made the story grow. In the days after Kornei Ostrov, the 64th Guards Tank Brigade continued west. The Sherman stayed behind for 2 full days while its fuel system was stripped, boiled, scraped, and rebuilt. When it finally rejoined the column, it carried scars that no welding could remove. The turret ring still ground when it turned. The engine sounded rougher than before. But it moved. In brigade headquarters, the battle was written up in dry language. At March 12, 1944, a single M4A2 Sherman had engaged enemy armor and infantry near Kornei Ostrov, destroying 2 Panzer IV tanks and 1 Stu-3 assault gun, holding the village until rifle units crossed the flooded river branch and secured the position. What did not appear in the report was the scarf, the gauze, the cotton, or the water bag. Only in a maintenance log, written by a junior technician, was there a strange line: fuel system contained foreign material, possibly cloth or fiber, origin unknown. That line was crossed out later. Among the crew, the story lived differently. They spoke of the moment when the engine died in the village and how they thought they would be taken alive or burned. They spoke of the panzer that returned when it smelled weakness. And always, they spoke of how the engine had lived just long enough to fight. Sorokin never explained exactly what he had done. He only said, "The engine wanted to live. I only helped it breathe." In April, near the Polish border, a young mechanic from another unit asked him if it was true that he had made a Sherman run on rags. Sorokin answered, "It did not run on rags. It ran on fear and time." The brigade lost many tanks that spring. Some were burned by German guns. Some drowned in rivers. Some broke and could not be saved. But the Sherman from Kornei Ostrov survived until July, when it was finally destroyed by a direct hit near the Vistula, its crew escaping on foot. Sorokin survived the war. He returned to civilian life and repaired tractors again. He never wrote memoirs. He never spoke in public. Years later, historians studying brigade records noticed something unusual. The kill claims at Kornei Ostrov did not match standard tactical patterns. A lone tank, separated from its unit, should not have survived such contact. Some suggested that the German tanks had already been damaged. Others believed the numbers were exaggerated. One historian wrote that the story of an improvised filter was likely a later invention, created by soldiers to explain survival that should not have happened. Another wrote that Soviet mechanics were known for extreme field improvisation and that such a repair, while dangerous, was possible for short periods. There was no photograph of the filter. No preserved fragment of scarf or cloth. Only the crossed out line in a maintenance log, and the fact that the tank had moved and fought when, by all technical rules, it should have died quietly in the mud. In one surviving diary from a rifleman who entered Kornei Ostrov that afternoon, there is a brief note. A lone Sherman stood in the square, silent like a dead horse. Around it were burned German tanks. The crew said their engine drank through cloth. I do not know if this is true, but they were alive, and that is enough. Whether the improvised filter truly worked as Sorokin claimed, or whether the engine lived by chance alone, no one can say with certainty. The war destroyed the evidence and kept only the result. 3 German tanks burned near a flooded Ukrainian village. 1 Sherman lived long enough to fight. And a mechanic walked away who knew that sometimes, in war, a machine does not survive because it is strong, but because someone refuses to let it stop breathing. To everyone listening, remember that behind every machine in war, there is a human hand, shaking, bleeding, and choosing not to give up.